Good morning, students. Yesterday we had covered the nobility and we had seen how important it was that the nobles and the whole culture of nobles was coming up in the medieval times in Europe. And as I also mentioned, and we had also seen that this was a similar practice which was being practiced in different parts of the world, of course, with the different names and a bit of modification here and there, but the basic structure was the same, whereby agriculture was becoming the most important activity, that is the economic activity, and the whole social life and the political life was also revolving around agriculture, and the people and the men who would control the maximum amount of land and the resources, that is in those days it would not naturally be animals, so they were the ones who were considered to be the feudal lords, and the people who would be working in those lands would also be directly accountable to the noble or the lord as he was, and he naturally was a very influential and a very powerful man. So the manorial estate, a lord had his own manor house. He also controlled villages. Some lords controlled hundreds of villages where peasants lived. Guys, exactly the same like we had in India, the zamindari system. A small manorial estate would contain a dozen families, while large estates might include 50 or 60. Almost everything needed for daily life was found in the estate. Grain was grown in the fields. Blacksmiths and carpenters maintained the lord's implements and repaired his weapons. Carpenters maintained the lord's weapons, while stonemasons looked after his buildings. Women spun and wove fabric, and children worked in the Lord's wine presses. Guys, you have to understand, wine presses is essentially you have the grapes, and then the whole production of wine is about pressing those grapes and extracting the juice out of it, and then the whole activity. So there, you have tons and tons of grapes which have to be pressed, and so that the juice comes out of it. The estate had extensive woodlands and forests where the lords hunted. They contained pastures where his cattle and his horses grazed. There was a church on the estate and a castle for defense. From the 3rd century, some castles were made bigger for use as a residence for a knight's family. In fact, in England, castles were practically unknown. Yeah, students, you have to understand one very important factor here. If you, because the peasants who were living within a campus for years and years and decades, you have to understand that the children also grew in the same campus, working for the same lord, or probably his children, the other generation, and they did not know about a world that existed outside those campuses, right? They had no idea about the world that existed outside the campuses. And to a great extent, they were even fearful of the world that existed outside it, because they did not want to be in that, because after all, they were poor people, and they felt a certain sense of security and certain sense of belonging, even when their conditions of living were wretched, but they still were kind of sentimentally attached to the land that they had been working for generations, their fathers and their fathers, and they would not like to venture outside. So naturally, you have to understand that the number of people who first started living in those areas, and after probably 60, 70 years, the numbers would certainly swell up, because people are getting old now. Probably the old man is not working anymore, right? But he would not be going to some other part of England. He would still be within those areas. So naturally, those areas are swelling, with people, more and more houses being built, the population growing up, and a whole community coming up, which had its own unique kind of culture, because they did not know about the world that existed outside, and they were pretty happy about it living there. And from the 13th century, that naturally made these nobles and very powerful people and very influential, because for them, the noble was everything. His family was everything for these hundreds and thousands of peasants. So From 13th century, some castles were made, so naturally the castles were made bigger for use as residence for a knight's family. In fact, in England, castles were practically unknown before Norman conquest and developed as centers of political administration and military power under the feudal system. So students, it is obvious that if the size of peasant population keeps growing up, then naturally more and more administrative complexities also keep coming up, right? The more people have to be managed. Now the production of all that, how much is being produced, how much is being sold, how much is being earned, all of that needed to be taken into account, and naturally more the complexity went up, and naturally the size of the administration also went up, and naturally at the same time when you have more people there, your army is also growing up, because at the end of the day you have to understand that you ultimately have to support the king with your army when he needs it, if he's been attacked by the neighboring kingdoms. The manor could not be completely self-sufficient because salt, millstones, and guys, what is Norman conquest? We just yes, practically unknown before the Norman conquest. Rather than getting into too many details of this Norman conquest, I'll tell you something very simple. Students, till 11th century, that is, England as we knew it then, England was essentially about a kind of, they were their people. It was very, very localized. People knew each other, and it was a pure race. And the British race and the English race, that's how it was. But then in 11th century, the French ruler William, he was known as William the Conqueror. Very interestingly, he crossed, guys, if you've seen the geography, you know that England is an island, right? It is an island, and there is English Channel between France and England. Okay, so this William the Conqueror, he was the king of Normandy, which is in France, and for the first time, he took his boats, his sailors, his army, crossed the English Channel and conquered England and became the king. Okay, so that is known as, because he came from the area of Normandy. Normandy, again, if some of you probably, I don't know if you've studied it in some book or probably watched it in some movies. Normandy was again very famous because that was the place when during the Second World War the Allied forces of the United States and British and all of them had landed on the shores of Normandy to fight against the Germans in France. Yes, so Normandy has been historically pretty important. Okay, so the knights from the 9th century, so we see that these estates were actually mini cities, mini towns in themselves, okay, where the people had almost everything that they needed. They would definitely venture out for, to buy certain items, but yes, but these were very, very self-sufficient uh, states of their own. Definitely, they would be selling their surpluses outside, naturally, because they have to earn money as well. But at the same time, they were very, very self-sufficient places. The knights. From 9th century, there were frequent wars in Europe. The amateur peasant soldiers were just not sufficient, and good cavalry was needed. Naturally, students, now the society is developing, evolving, and getting more and more complex. So now different nobles have different powers, different people, different number of people work for them. Now they are getting richer and richer. Now once you get rich, now once you get important, you get powerful, then you are also under threat from the neighboring forces. So now earlier at that point in time, the nobles would just recruit soldiers from among the people who were peasants, right? Young, able-bodied men whom they felt that he thod lamba choda hai, so they would recruit them as their soldiers, and they were pretty okay about it. But then, as the complexity went up, and then they came into more and more threat. Now, because as we just saw during the during the Norman conquest, for the first time, the British felt कि यार, because we happen to be an island, that does not mean that we cannot be conquered, or we are not under threat, or maybe England is impregnable. No, it was not that way. For the first time, they felt ki no, we can also be, nature can provide us a certain amount of security, but not, it is not a foolproof security at all. And naturally, you can understand, when there were insecurities in England, there had to be insecurities in France as well, because France did not even have the seas protecting it, because it was part of the mainland Europe. Now, different nobles, different kings were always threatening you with their soldiers and with their forces. So now it was being felt that just these part-time soldiers, part-time farmers, and part-time soldiers, they just would not be sufficient enough to protect you from the invaders, whoever they were, because once they would invade, they would bring their best soldiers. After all, they had to conquer the territories. So they felt that these farmers who were just kind of given a basic swords training, or probably bow and arrow training, would not be sufficient. And that was the time when the birth of a specialized soldier, a battle hardy soldier, that was the time when that took birth, and they were known as the knights, who knew nothing except fighting. They were not part time soldiers, they were 24 by 7 soldiers, and they were right from the very young days, they were bred, and they were brought up in a fashion where only the best of soldiers, they were given the best of training, even when they were barely 5 or 6 or 7 year old kids, right? They were not part time farmers and part time soldiers at all. And that was the time when the culture of knights came up, and they were linked to the lords just as the latter were linked to the king. The lord gave the knights a piece of land called fief and promised to protect it. The fief could be inherited. It extended to anything between 1,000 and 2,000 acres or more, including a house for the knight and his family, a church, and other establishments to house his dependents, besides a watermill and a wine press. As in a feudal manner, the land of the fief was cultivated by peasants. In exchange, the knights paid his lord a regular fee and promised to fight him in the war. Okay, so that is how it was. We shall continue. Thanks.